This is the manual for school leaders that I use in case you are interested. This definition comes right out of the book, but what I like to tell people is once you grasp the understanding of the conceptual framework, the tools, it's really beneficial to you to create your own definition. Create the definition as you understand it. So for me, it is really about that paradigm shift that I shared earlier, moving away from seeing culture, race, ethnicity, gender identity as a problem to be solved, but instead using what we understand, our cultural proficiency, to leverage it as a means of really creating a high-quality education. We can no longer just stick our heads in the sand. We really have to be forward-thinking. We have to have that growth mindset. And as I stated, there are 4 tools to cultural proficiency. Some of this you may be familiar, but it's important to know, and I will, in this short moment of time, try to explain it to you so that not necessarily that you understand each tool or the framework, but that you're making connections as to how it can serve to support you in the implementation of ethnic studies. There are 4 tools: the barriers, the guiding principles, the continuum, and the essential elements. This is the conceptual framework. This is also in your folder. There's a hard card that has the tools on both sides. You can turn it over. It'll be a lot easier to read than all of this. But you see the blue arrow? It's pointing to overcoming barriers to cultural proficiency. I would submit to you that this particular tool is what you're going to have to know how to maneuver through, because this is the pushback, if you will. This is people not wanting to change, wanting to keep the status quo. And as you look at this framework, just know this: orient yourself from bottom to top and left to right. You see the overcoming the barriers to cultural proficiency is on the left side. The guiding principles are on the right. The left side are the unhealthy, unproductive, and inequitable policies, practices, and behaviors. That's where you find overcoming the barriers. On the right side are the guiding principles, and those inform the healthy, productive, and equitable policies, practices, and behavior. So there's a method to this layout here. You see in the middle it says ethical tension. That's what happens when the barriers bump up against the guiding principles or the values. And so that's where a lot of people tend to get stuck, and we start going in circles and we don't move. The middle bar there, that is the third tool. That's the continuum. And that serves as a point of reference for ourselves as well as our organization. You always need to know where you're at in order to know where to move to. And so there's also a handout provided for you with this continuum, and it actually shows the continuum with colonization on the right, colonization on the left, decolonization on the right. And so it fits in my opinion, doing this work, that's where I made the connection of the importance of ethnic studies. Ethnic studies is healthy and productive and an equitable policy practice. Then the very top one are the essential elements. When we talk about equity requires action, as you heard me say before, without action there is no equity. We use these 5 essential elements. They're action words to actually create praxis and create change. But just kind of put that where it's at this point. I want to right now ask you to go to that shared folder, and you should be able to see in there's a chapter 5 PDF in there, and you'll see the tool Overcoming the Barriers. So you'll need to get to that chapter to do this next activity. What I'm going to ask you to do is we're going to jigsaw Overcoming the Barriers. So if you can get to that chapter, you'll see these 4 barriers as pointed out up here: systemic oppression, sense of entitlement and unearned privilege, unawareness of the need to adapt, and the resistance to change. In that chapter, it's broken down into those 4 components. What I would like for you to do at your table, you don't have to do all 4, but just pick one at your table, read briefly what's in that chapter, and then think about how it might connect to the work that you're doing at LACO or to the implementation of ethnic studies. So for example, when we think about ethnic studies, why is it important to overcome the barrier of systemic oppression, right? Yeah, I think you can make some very distinct correlations as to how that informs the implementation of ethnic studies. And so just pick one. You don't have to do all 4. At your table, decide which one of those you want to delve a little bit deeper into, and then we'll go ahead. And then at your table, come up with 3 most important points of what you've learned about overcoming that barrier, or how knowing this barrier, or how this barrier influences your implementation of ethnic studies. If we can bring our table talk conversations to a close, I need 4 volunteers, 1 for each of the barriers. And to entice volunteers, I have some free books down here that I would like to pass out to volunteers. It's a variety of books. One of them is the Manual for School Leaders, Culturally Proficient Learning Communities. This is the latest book by Dr. Jamie Wellborn, who we both worked together doing this training, called Leading Change Through the Lens of Cultural Proficiency. It is research-backed with the work she did in the Midwest. I have another book here, Culturally Proficient Inclusive Schools, All Means All. Culturally Proficient Practice, Supporting Educators and English Language Learners. The Cultural Proficiency Manifesto by Dr. Randy Lindsay. Culturally Proficient Coaching. And one of my favorites, White Fragility by Dr. Robin DiAngelo. So, 4 volunteers. First come, first serve. So who wants to go first?
So I think one of the things we looked at it in a multi-layered kind of way, in this idea that, oftentimes when we teach, we sometimes get stuck in the rut of like continuing to do the same cycle of things we've done every single year. And ever since the pandemic, kids are different. Same thing, like every decade, every 5 years, or sometimes every year, we have a whole different group of challenges with different kids, and our teaching needs to reflect that. And we talked about how unawareness is sometimes one of the biggest hurdles when trying to get people to teach stuff like ethnic studies, because they're unaware of the need to change. And then you have to not only bring that awareness, then you have to do the other work of getting them to make that change after they've been aware of it. And one of the things like we also talked about was, the dynamic of kids are changing, and the activities that we want to do with kids need to be changed as well. And we talked about gamified learning, and it takes more prep work for us. It's a lot more challenges for teachers, but this is also where we need districts to step up and support teachers in making those adaptations. Because as we want to make that awareness and we want to help people change, we still need to be valued for our time and be compensated for that time, and districts need to support that of the teachers.
Thank you for sharing that. One of the big paradigm shifts when I was at Santa Maria High School was that the average number of years of the teaching staff, 120 teachers, was 20 years at that high school. So what we had to do was remind folks that we have to stop trying to teach the kids that used to go here. They're not here anymore. And so we have to adapt. We have to change, right? We have to change. And so thank you for bringing it. Come on up and grab a book. I'll let you pick. Over here. Okay. Let me turn off my mic.
We talked a little bit about overcoming resistance, and I think one of the things that we've sort of heard is like, how do we implement this super important piece into our schools? And there's a bullet point that said that sometimes you don't know the best process until after you're finished. And so it sort of, at least for me, gave me the liberty to say, I'm going to build this house, but I'm not going to build it alone. And I'm going to invite people to come into it. It's not going to be perfect, and everybody gets to sort of help me build it. And then we can go back and say, this is what we did wrong, this is what we did right, here's where we can expand, here's what we need to collapse. But if we sit and try to build the best house, no one is ever going to occupy it.
Yes, we can't wait to do this work till we think it's perfected, right? And I would tell you this, even myself that has done this work for a long time, it's messy. I mean, invariably, it gets a little messy, but the worst thing we can do is be afraid to take that first step forward. And Ron mentioned that first step is critical. You don't have to solve the whole implementation plan in the first year. You just need to break those barriers. Okay.
So we read the unawareness of the need to adapt, and we were talking about just how so many people have a vested interest in like the dominant systems and the dominant values that exist like just in the US, but also like within the system of education. And like people who are resistant to paradigm shifts and paradigm changes and resistant to changing what they know and what they have taught and what they have known for years and years and years. And I think like as a new educator, I think coming in and just having a different perspective on ethnic studies and a different perspective on these changes that we're trying to make, I feel like it's interesting to kind of like learn this and understand this and realize like the changes that need to happen and that like we need to make. And so much of that has to do with just changing perspectives and changing how people think about ethnic studies like as a whole and as a field and why it's necessary.
And what you talk about there is the inside-out approach. We have to look at our perspectives and ask ourselves, what makes us feel uncomfortable? Why do we feel uncomfortable? And I'll tell you what, I'll put them right here. You can go ahead and pick. What makes us feel uncomfortable? It's being comfortable in the uncomfortable and not being afraid to change. The only thing about change, though, as we all know, change is difficult. I'll share a quick story. I was in the United States Navy, and I served when women could not serve on ships. You want to talk about difficult change? when we had to introduce women to change, and the whole culture changed. I was actually one of those, kind of naysayers, and then they made me the woman at sea coordinator for an aircraft carrier, so, it really opened my eyes. But, okay, one more.
We were kind of having a difficult time maybe kind of finding the graph, but we did all agree when we mentioned the fact that change is really difficult, but knowing that there's a need to change. What's interesting is if you live in different areas of the United States, there's different cultures of what they want the curriculum to be. And so I came to a new culture where this is a popular, productive theme. And from my personal perspective, and for anyone else who moves to a different region in the country where the culture may be a bit different, is to focus on the initial few minutes of your speech today or your talk today about knowing your audience of who you're teaching, like your general district, and understanding that. So I'm learning a lot about this district that I'm in and accommodating to the students, and it took me 4 weeks to get to know the kids before I could actually tell them what I was actually teaching, because they had to learn to trust me and where I came from, and then me also knowing them. I had gotten to the mature stage of being able to overcome being resistant to it and being scared to do that. But if I tried to teach this where I'm from in another part of the country, there would be tremendous amount of resistance. I would be a super unpopular teacher because people don't want to change in certain areas. I'm glad to be here. Very glad, because I like having a job. So, thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Interesting enough, we did training in Buffalo, the Western region. Please pick a book. And we were in Seneca Nation, and it was interesting to us that the Western region of New York has a large Native American population and indigenous population. And I had never encountered that kind of barrier, that there were teachers that felt that it wasn't fair or it wasn't right, that part of the process or the system was that when indigenous Native American students graduated, they would actually get a small sum of money. And I couldn't believe the resentment that caused. But, you know, again, it goes back to our understanding of the inequities that exist, the unlevel playing field. Right now, throughout our national discourse, there's a lot of conversation about reparations, right, and some of those things. And it's really important to understand why that is and look for ways to maybe make things more equitable with regards to that. So thank you for mentioning that. Right here.
So we looked at the privilege and entitlement one, and we kind of had a discussion about the quote about the achievement gap. It said that the disconnect is being aware of the downside, but not the upside of systematic oppression. That is the achievement gap, right? And a lot of times when we look at school data and we look at high-performing schools, right, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's equity in the educational system for all, right? And how do you fight those systems of systemic institutional oppression for those groups in the educational system in, you know, some of our higher performing schools?
Absolutely. I mean, my lens has actually expanded beyond the achievement gap. Now I think about things like the opportunity gap, the equity gaps for college, the changes in affirmative action, all these other things that really do come into play. Please come and grab a book. You know, it's like we try to always find that magic bullet, or that here's the reason this is happening. But again, I'm going to submit to you that it really means that the way we're going to change things is we have to look at being transformative, and not necessarily just transformational, right? It's about what is causing the inequities that are occurring, and might we be some of the reason that that's occurring. All right. Here's a question just for the audience, the group. Of those 4 barriers, which one do you think, for you working here in Laco, it might be the most difficult? Which one presents the biggest barrier? Now, I know that a lot of them will be presented in a different, you know, variety of ways, but if you were to look at having to overcome these barriers, which one do you think in your school site might be the most difficult?
So I think number one is kind of the undergirds all of the rest of them. So I would have to say, you know, I'd have to say number one, it makes all the rest of them even possible.
Definitely number one, I mean, you have to recognize that it still exists, right? A good mentor of mine, Dr. Ken Magdaleno, talks about the acknowledgement gap. Acknowledging that systemic oppression is still occurring. Don't think about it as a thing of the past, right? And when we really do that inside out and we're looking at our policies, practices, and behaviors, what are those behaviors that are covert, meaning out in the open, but also, which are overt, which are out in the open, but also which are covert, or the unwritten rules that occur, or the things that are happening in the, I like to say, in the parking lot, where people are talking about things, or they maybe think about things that it will never change, for example. What I want to point out as far as my journey was, one of the first ones that I attacked on this was the unawareness of the need to adapt. I called it, that's your mulligan, right? I get to, you know, kind of make you aware of something, right? And so I would use data, right? Data is good for bringing things to the surface, and you go, hey, Did you know, so here's a great example that worked well for me. We noticed that we had a lot of elementary school kids coming to our high school district that were long-term English learners. I mean, it was the rate was incredible. And people kind of knew that, but they never really like sprung to action, right? It was kind of like, well, it's just, we have a lot of newcomers. And then so when I researched that and I looked and I said, you know what? We have very few newcomers, very few. So what if I rephrase it this way? We have 63% of our elementary school teachers are not proficient in reading. And out of that 63%, 55% are American citizens. They were born in the United States. They were born and raised in Santa Maria. So that put a different kind of, that created a paradigm shift. And what is it that, we have kids that have been born here, raised here, gone throughout our district, and still are not proficient. It's not newcomer students. But that's kind of the making people aware of the need to adapt. That's your mulligan. I make you aware that there are inequitable practices, there's deficit thinking, and then from that point on, I can hold you accountable. And we hold each other accountable because now people are making a conscious decision to still hold on to things that present barriers. So I always like to address the unawareness of the need to adapt because I can't tell you how many times people have said, I never knew that, or I didn't think about it that way. I didn't know that I was actually, using microaggressions and trying to communicate with my students. So address the unawareness of the need to adapt. Sense of privilege and entitlement, unearned privilege and entitlement is difficult for people. They always think it's about, well, I worked hard for what I got. No, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that unearned privilege where some people have to worry about things that you don't have to worry about, whether it's based on gender, gender identity, race, ethnicity, language. That's what we're talking about when we say privilege and entitlement, right? And then the resistance to change. If you look in that chapter that I provided you, there is a section in there that gives like 12 key points of how to address resistance to change. And, because I will tell you, you can't do this work alone. And as was mentioned earlier, you have a lot of support within this room to not have to reinvent the wheel, to not have to go it alone, but together you can create best practices and know how to move things forward. All right. Well, my time is almost up. So what I'm going to do at this point, I'm going to close this out. I thank you for your participation today. I have 4 books left up here. I don't want to take them back. So whoever wants to come up and claim them at the end, you can go ahead and claim them. So let me keep moving here. Someone had asked me about this video. It's a great video that I use for my training. It talks about stereotypes. I actually got to meet them in person, the 2 violinists, and they're actually relatives of Raymond Terrell, who wrote the book on Manual for School Leaders, Cultural Proficiency. I'm not going to show it to you today, but these are some of the things resources that I do. Somebody said social media. I like social media, but I'm kind of intimidated by it. So, these are kind of some of the things that I bring in. We were going to do the guiding principle, but this will be in your folder. I'm going to go ahead and get past this. These are very important. You also have this in your folder, the World Cafe, and it explains what the 9 guiding principles out, and it tells you how to do this activity. So that'll be in there for you. There are Google Slides that you would fill in. What does this guiding principle mean to us as educators? How does this guiding principle relate to what we're trying to do here at, in opening doors? So that's in your resources as well. There's 3 parts to it. This article is also in there. It ties together the guiding principles and overcoming the barriers. And then where the rubber meets the road are the essential elements. I'm going to zoom through these. They're probably the most important, but I don't feel that I could do it justice, but I can just at least make you aware of 5 essential elements: assessing culture, valuing diversity, managing the dynamics of difference, and adapting to diversity. This is a cycle that we go through every time. How do you know who your student population, how do you assess your culture? If somebody says they don't have a sense of belonging, how are you assessing that? When you say you value diversity, is it just heroes, holidays, and food? Or is it displayed in the manners and the behaviors that you have with other people? And then when there's conflict, how do you manage the dynamics of difference? And then once all that is said and done, after all that hard work, you want to adapt to diversity, and then finally institutionalize cultural knowledge so you don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. So these are some of the definitions. Again, I'm going to zip through these. I apologize if I'm going too fast. There will be in your folder. These are some slides that explain each one of them. This is the activity. If we have more time, we would go through. So here we come to the end of our program. I would like for you to take about 3 minutes to reflect on what connections you're making between the cultural proficiency framework, which I shared with you briefly, which you've looked at in your folders, and how do you see that it can support your work in LACO? Also, I would like for you to think about one comment or question that you have about the framework. I would ask that you put it on a Post-it and leave it at your table. I'll come around and pick them up, and then I can find some answers for you. Send it to Dr. Williams, and I can get back to you. Resources that I've used these 3 resources that are very helpful to me. That book there, Ethnic Studies in Schools. Dr. Christine Sleeter, who will be here tomorrow, helped write this book. Obviously, the Rethinking Ethnic Studies book was helpful as well. And then the Knowledge for Justice goes a little deeper into each of the integral parts. Here are some other resources that I've used. Does anybody know about the Learning for Justice? It used to be called Teaching for Tolerance, and they changed their name because it was not sufficient to be tolerant. We have to, again, action steps, Learning for Justice. That has a lot of good stuff in there. On their website, they have a lot of curriculum and instruction and stuff like that. 1491, that's, again, more history that we're unaware of. As Dr. Randy Lindsay always told me, how is it that Columbus could have discovered a place that was already inhabited, right? And so it's that shift. And then the racial innocence. I'm always really interested in the relationship between Black and Latino cultures. And as it was stated before, I think we're not enemies. We are, we're actually in this together. So last thing I'm going to ask you, if you can all, there's a feedback form. You can use this bit.ly or this stamp. It'll take you to this grow, glow, and know. And glow means something that worked well for you today, or one thing from today's training that resonated with you, or what is one thing, kind of redundant there, that you would like the facilitator to continue to do. That's glow. Grow, what is one thing from today's session that could use improvement? Maybe something you would like to see change for our next session together. Know, what is one thing you would like the facilitator to know more about, or something you want the facilitator to know about your experience today. This is my constructive criticism for myself so I can make this training mucho better for other people. That's my commitment to all of you. Does everybody have a chance to do this? Please do it, because This information is really important, and it's also data collection for LACO and, you know, for their assessment of the training. This is something that I would do in a circle. We're not going to do this today, but this is very powerful, another strategy, and I'll include how to do this strategy in the folder. But I want to end you with this. This is something that I really feel strongly about all of you and the impact that we can have on others. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightening about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we consciously give other people permission to do the same. And as we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. That's my message to you today. I've really enjoyed being here with you. I hope if you invite me back or if you want to carry on the conversation, here's my information. And please remember, cultural proficiency is a journey, not a place in which we arrive. We're constantly learning how to educate our youth and all our students so they can thrive. Thank you very much. Es un placer.